instinct. You know, Nietzsche, when he proclaimed the death of God, which by the way was no triumphant proclamation, because he also mentioned that we would never find enough water to wash away the blood, which was his, what would you call it, prognostication for the 20th century, and a very accurate one at that. He believed that we would, in some sense, have to become as gods in ourselves in order to replace what we had lost. He thought that the collapse of the Judeo-Christian structure would be absolutely catastrophic for the West, and I believe that he was correct. And that the way out of that would be that we'd have to create our own values. We'd have to take the place of what was once, let's say, externalized and divine onto ourselves. And, you know, it's a hell of a theory. And it's not, and Nietzsche is not an easy person to criticize, because you have to do a lot of reading before you find someone who's 1/10 as smart as Nietzsche. He has this funny line about his books. It's really quite comical. He said, it takes most writers a whole book to write what I can write in a sentence. Then he said, no, they can't even manage it in a book. And that's actually true. I mean, if you read Nietzsche, Beyond Good and Evil, for example, you see that his thought is so powerful that it's really a kind of miracle. What the psychoanalysts realized, though, this was particularly Jung's contribution, I would say, Carl Jung's contribution. He was a great student of Nietzsche, a real admirer of Nietzsche, and really someone who was trying to solve the problem that Nietzsche had put forward, which was, well, our underlying metaphysics, our religious structure had collapsed, and that was the story upon which our entire culture was based, for better or worse. It had collapsed. And we needed to do something about that, and we were doing various things. We were turning to fascism, let's say, or we were turning to communism, both ideological replacements for more fundamental religious beliefs. But that Nietzsche's suggestion that we turn to ourselves to extract out our own values, to create our own values, let me be more accurate about that, happened to be untrue, because we weren't the sort of creatures who were actually capable of doing that. And it's one of the reasons I love Jung and his biological take, in some sense, towards human beings, because Jung firmly believed, and I think all of the evidence supports him, believed that human beings actually had a nature, you know, that we weren't merely social constructions, which we certainly aren't, despite what the social constructionists insist upon forcing us to think increasingly through legislative means, and that we had to wrestle with what it was that we were. You know, even though we're our own creatures in some sense, we also have to wrestle with our intrinsic nature. And we know about the nature part of that more and more. I mean, we know more about our neurocircuitry, for example. We know that there's a circuit for rage, and there's a circuit for fear, and there's a biological system for jealousy, and there's a system for altruism, and there's a circuit for play, and there's another one for pleasure, and there's a complex circuit for negative emotion, pain and anxiety and frustration and disappointment and guilt and shame. And we know that human beings share that motivational structure not only with all other human beings, but certainly with all mammals and almost all animals. And so that biological component of us is unbelievably deep, right? It's tens of millions, hundreds of millions, and even billions of years old. I read an interesting paper just the other day. You know, I tend to talk about lobsters more than the average person, and one of the points I made in 12 Rules for Life was that our neurochemistry, at least some of it, is so similar. It's been conserved so completely throughout the immense duration of evolution, hundreds of millions of years, that lobsters, like human beings, appear to become the lobster equivalent of depressed if they suffer a hierarchy defeat, and that if you give them chemicals that are roughly analogous to human antidepressants, it perks them right back up. Their posture improves, and they'll go off and fight. And you know, when I first discovered that, it just blew me away. I never recovered from it. I thought, my God, really, that the continent is 350 million years of continuity in the structure of those systems. And, we know the serotonin system, which is the system I'm talking about, does govern your observation of where you sit in a social hierarchy, like it does for many, many animal species. And as one consequence of that, regulates your emotions, so that if it sees that you're a relatively high status creature in your local environment, then it tends to allow you to feel more positive emotion and less negative emotion. And if it sees you as a low status creature in your local comparative environment, then it does the opposite. It overwhelms you with negative emotion and suppresses positive emotion. And so, and that's really bad. No one likes that. It's fundamentally, there's really nothing worse that can happen to you than that, to have those emotions adjusted in that manner, so that the incentive reward and the motivation and the positive emotion vanishes from your life. So there's nothing to be enthusiastic or excited about, and all of the negative emotions, pain, disappointment, frustration, grief, all of those terrible negative emotions are tremendously magnified. No one wants that. It's the last thing you want. Perhaps it's the last thing you want. And, that's partly why people are very, let's call it, what would you say? They're willing to fight for their position in their status hierarchy, and even for the existence of the hierarchies